Let me be direct with you from the outset. What was signed in Tehran last week is not a simple trade agreement. It is not another Belt and Road Memorandum of Understanding. It is not the kind of diplomatic paperwork that gets filed away and forgotten within a month. What was signed in Tehran last week is a complete restructuring of how energy security works in the Middle East. And most people watching the news have no idea it even happened. I am looking at a document that was finalized on April 23, 2026, between Iran's Ministry of Petroleum and a consortium of Chinese state enterprises led by Sinopec and the China National Petroleum Corporation. The signing ceremony happened at the Sadabad Palace in northern Tehran. There were no Western journalists present. Reuters ran a three-paragraph story buried on page 11 of their international coverage. The New York Times mentioned it in passing as the 18th item in their Middle East briefing. But what this document actually contains is not a footnote to regional politics. It is a 25-year energy and infrastructure partnership valued at $427 billion that fundamentally rewrites the economic relationship between Beijing and Tehran, locks American sanctions policy into irrelevance, and accelerates the construction of a Eurasian trade corridor that bypasses every choke point the United States Navy currently controls. In the next 18 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what this agreement contains, why it represents the largest sanctions evasion architecture ever constructed, and why the timing of this signing, 1 week after the collapse of the Vienna nuclear talks, is not a coincidence. This is Daily Brief. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively analyzed by American strategic planners who are realizing they may have lost leverage they assumed was permanent. Let's start with the geography and the history, because without understanding both, none of what happened last week makes sense. Iran sits on the world's second largest natural gas reserves and the fourth largest proven oil reserves. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Iran holds approximately 1,193 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and roughly 157 billion barrels of crude oil. To put that in perspective, that is more gas than Russia's proven reserves in several key fields, and more oil than Iraq and Kuwait combined. Yet for the past 2 decades, Iran has been unable to fully monetize those resources because of sanctions, technology restrictions, and the systematic exclusion from Western financial systems. China, meanwhile, is the world's largest importer of crude oil. In 2025, China imported 11.3 million barrels of oil per day. Approximately 48% of that oil transited through the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that Iran sits directly beside and has openly stated it can close in a matter of hours if militarily threatened. China's leadership has made energy security the cornerstone of its long-term strategic planning, and every pathway they have explored to diversify away from Hormuz, away from the Suez Canal, and away from sea routes patrolled by the U.S. Navy leads them to one conclusion. They need a land bridge, they need pipelines, they need Iran. According to multiple sources, including reporting from the South China Morning Post and analysts at the Atlantic Council, Chinese officials have been negotiating the framework for this partnership since 2019. But the final version, the one signed last week, is far more comprehensive than earlier drafts. It includes not just energy exports and infrastructure investment. It includes port construction, railway development, telecommunications networks, and a joint banking mechanism explicitly designed to function outside the SWIFT system. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of detail from mainstream coverage. Now let us talk about what China and Iran actually built into this agreement, because the structure of it reveals exactly how they are thinking about the next 25 years. Announcement number 1, the energy purchase commitments. And this one matters more than anything else because it establishes the financial backbone of everything that follows. Under the terms of this agreement, China has committed to purchasing a minimum of $280 billion worth of Iranian oil and natural gas over the next 25 years. That breaks down to roughly $11. $2 billion per year, or approximately 620,000 barrels of oil per day, plus liquefied natural gas exports that will increase incrementally as new infrastructure comes online. The price structure is pegged to a discount model averaging 19% below Brent crude benchmarks, which gives China a cost advantage while still providing Iran with revenue that exceeds anything they were earning during the peak sanctions period from 2018 to 2021. According to reporting by Bloomberg and confirmed by sources within the Iranian Ministry of Petroleum, these transactions will not be conducted in US dollars. They will be settled in Chinese yuan, with a secondary barter mechanism that allows Iran to receive payment in the form of industrial goods, telecommunications equipment, and military technology. The U.S. Treasury Department has acknowledged publicly that it has no enforcement mechanism to prevent yuan-denominated energy trades between sovereign nations, particularly when those transactions are processed through Chinese state banks that are already disconnected from Western clearing systems. China currently operates between 8 and 12 tankers under flags of convenience that are specifically tasked with moving Iranian crude to Chinese refineries. That number matters. According to ship tracking data from tanker trackers, and analysis from Reuters, these vessels operate with their AIS transponders turned off for significant portions of their voyages. They refuel at sea using ship-to-ship transfers, and they offload at Chinese ports that are not monitored by Western satellite surveillance with any regularity. The entire supply chain has been designed to be sanction-proof, and the scale of it, 620,000 barrels per day, is roughly equivalent to the entire daily oil consumption of Spain. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the infrastructure build-out, and this is the part that changes the geography of Eurasian trade for the next generation. The agreement allocates $147 billion toward infrastructure projects inside Iran. That is not a loan. That is not financing that Iran has to repay with interest. That is direct Chinese investment in the form of construction, engineering, and technology transfer. The projects include the expansion of Chabahar Port on Iran's southeastern coast, the construction of a high-speed rail corridor connecting Tehran to the Chinese border through Turkmenistan, the development of a fiber-optic telecommunications network covering 94% of Iran's landmass, and the modernization of Iran's electrical grid with an emphasis on renewable energy and grid storage. Chabahar Port is not just a commercial shipping terminal, it is a strategic alternative to the Strait of Hormuz. When the port expansion is completed, projected for late 2028, it will be capable of handling Panamax-class container ships and will serve as the primary logistics hub for trade moving between China, Central Asia, and East Africa. India, which had been investing in Chabahar as part of its own connectivity strategy, has now been effectively sidelined. According to diplomatic sources cited by the Hindu and the Times of India, Indian officials were not consulted about the expansion plans and learned about the scope of Chinese involvement only after the signing ceremony last week. The rail corridor is even more significant. It will connect the Chinese city of Kashgar in Xinjiang province to Tehran, and from Tehran to the Mediterranean coast via existing and planned rail links through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. The entire route bypasses the Suez Canal, bypasses the Strait of Hormuz, and bypasses maritime choke points where the U.S. Navy maintains a presence. Freight that currently takes 45 to 60 days to move from Chinese factories to European markets via container ship will take 18 to 22 days via this rail corridor. The cost savings and the speed advantage are not marginal, they are structural. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the implications for American influence in the region become impossible to ignore. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The agreement includes a security cooperation framework that allows for joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, and the potential sale of advanced Chinese weapons systems to Iran. According to a report from Defense Security Asia and analysis from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the security provisions include Chinese technical support for Iran's domestic missile production programs, radar and air defense integration, and naval cooperation focused on subsurface warfare and anti-ship capabilities. China will station military advisors in Iran. Iran will participate in joint naval drills in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The two countries will share intelligence on U.S. and allied military deployments across the broader Middle East and Indo-Pacific theaters. The reason this matters is the same reason the economic components matter. It creates overlapping dependencies that make it nearly impossible for the United States to pressure either country without triggering costs it is not prepared to absorb. If Washington imposes secondary sanctions on Chinese banks for processing Iranian oil payments, Beijing can retaliate by restricting rare earth exports or dumping U.S. Treasury holdings. If Washington escalates militarily against Iranian proxies in the region, Tehran can threaten Chinese energy supplies transiting the Strait of Hormuz, forcing Beijing to either back Iran diplomatically or face domestic energy shortages. Every lever the U.S. tries to pull is now connected to a counter-lever that Beijing and Tehran control together. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let us talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are two stories playing out simultaneously and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The story you are hearing is that this agreement represents Iranian desperation, that sanctions have worked, that Iran has been forced to accept unfavorable terms from China, that Tehran has sold its sovereignty for cash, and that this proves the U.S. maximum pressure campaign achieved its objectives. That narrative is being pushed by officials in Washington, by think tanks that receive funding from Gulf Arab states, and by commentators who have spent the last 4 years insisting that Iran would capitulate if only the pressure continued long enough. The story you are not hearing is that this agreement represents a deliberate strategic choice by both parties to construct an alternative economic and security architecture that does not depend on Western institutions, Western approval, or Western enforcement. Iran is not desperate. Iran is diversifying. China is not exploiting a weak partner. China is locking in energy supplies and logistical infrastructure that will define its economy for the next quarter century. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States walked away from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2018, European allies condemned the decision. France, Germany, and the United Kingdom attempted to create a financial mechanism called INSTEX to preserve trade with Iran outside the dollar system. It failed, not because the idea was flawed, but because European banks were too afraid of U.S. secondary sanctions to participate. China does not have that problem. Chinese state banks do not care if they are cut off from Wall Street because they are not dependent on dollar clearing for their domestic operations. Beijing looked at the European failure and built a system that actually works. The same officials who told you that maximum pressure would force Iran back to the negotiating table on American terms are now telling you that this Chinese partnership proves Iran is isolated. But isolation would mean having no options. What Iran has done is replace one set of economic relationships with another set that cannot be sanctioned away by Washington. That is not isolation. That is realignment. If you are an American taxpayer, if you are someone who has watched U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for the past 2 decades, what is happening in Tehran is not a trade story. It is a credibility story. It is a story about what happens when the largest economy in the world writes security guarantees, walks away from them, and then discovers that the countries it abandoned have found other partners who will honor their commitments. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. The Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta went to war. 27 years. Both sides exhausted their treasuries, devastated their populations, and destroyed the political structures that had made them powerful. And who won? Macedon. Philip II and later his son Alexander swept in and conquered a Greek world that had spent a generation bleeding itself into irrelevance. The two rivals were so focused on defeating each other that neither noticed the third power rising in the north. The United States is Athens. It sees itself as the indispensable democratic power, the rules-based order, the city on a hill. Iran is Sparta. Militarized, defiant, willing to endure hardship to resist external control. Both have been locked in confrontation since 1979, and China is Macedon. It is not fighting either side directly. It is waiting, building, and positioning itself to inherit a regional order that the two rivals are too busy fighting each other to defend. The parallel is exact. The U.S. spends trillions on military deployments across the Middle East to contain Iran. Iran spends billions on proxy militias and missile programs to resist American pressure. And China writes checks, builds ports, and signs energy contracts. When the exhaustion finally sets in, when Washington and Tehran have spent themselves into diminishing returns, Beijing will own the infrastructure, the trade routes, and the relationships that actually matter. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1, Washington accepts the new reality. The Biden administration, or whichever administration follows, recognizes that the maximum pressure campaign failed to achieve its stated objectives, returns to some version of the nuclear agreement, lifts sanctions in exchange for Iranian compliance on enrichment limits, and competes with China for influence in Tehran on economic terms rather than military threats. This would require admitting that the policies of the past 8 years were counterproductive. The likelihood of that happening in the current political environment is low, but it is not zero. Path 2, Washington escalates. The U.S. attempts to enforce secondary sanctions on Chinese banks, threatens military action against Iranian infrastructure projects, and tries to force European and Asian allies to choose between access to the American market and access to Iranian energy. This path leads to a fracturing of the Western alliance, accelerates the formation of a Beijing-led bloc, and increases the probability of a miscalculation that triggers direct military conflict. It is the path of greatest risk and diminishing returns. Path 3, and this is the one I think we are already on, Washington does nothing effective. Statements are issued. Sanctions are announced, but poorly enforced. Allies are lectured, but not supported. And year by year, Chinese investment transforms Iran into a logistical hub that American policy can complain about, but cannot reverse. This is not a dramatic collapse. It is a slow deterioration of leverage disguised as strategic patience. I think we are on path 3. The signing in Tehran last week was not a surprise to American intelligence agencies. They knew it was coming, they watched it happen. And they have no coherent response because every option available requires cost that American voters, American allies, and American banks are not willing to pay. The result is a policy of symbolic opposition that changes nothing on the ground while Chinese engineers lay rail track and Chinese tankers load crude oil. Here are the questions I want you to take away. How much longer can the United States maintain military commitments in the Middle East if the economic architecture of the region is being rewritten without American participation? What happens to the petrodollar system when the world's largest oil importer is conducting all of its transactions in yuan? And what happens to American credibility when the countries Washington threatens simply build alternative systems and proceed without permission? Tell me in the comments what you think the administration does next. Tell me if you believe Washington has any realistic leverage left to change Iran's strategic calculus, or if that leverage has already been permanently eroded. We will keep tracking every development in Tehran, Beijing, and Washington because this story is not over. It has only just entered its most consequential phase. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand how the global order is actually shifting beneath the noise of daily headlines. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next briefing.